Your grandmother never threw away a plastic bag, not once. She washed them, dried them over the kitchen faucet, folded them neatly, and kept them in a drawer stuffed so full it barely closed. As a child, you thought it was a quirk, maybe even embarrassing. But if you asked her why, she would not say it was about the bags. She would say something about waste, about not knowing when things would run out, about how you keep what you have, because you never know when there will be more. And then she would change the subject, because the real answer, the answer that lived below the words she could find, was something she had never been given the language to explain, something that had happened before she was old enough to understand it, passed into her nervous system through years of watching her own parents move through the world with the quiet, permanent tension of people who had learned, at a very deep level, that safety was temporary and scarcity was the natural order of things. This is not a story about plastic bags. It is a story about inheritance, not the kind written into wills or passed through legal documents, but the kind that travels invisibly through families across decades, shaping the way each new generation thinks about money, about risk, about their own worth, and about what is actually possible for people like them. Generational poverty is a subject that gets discussed mostly in economic terms. Statistics about income brackets, mobility rates, median household wealth broken down by zip code and demographic, and the data matters. But data does not explain what happens inside a child who grows up watching their parents panic every time an unexpected bill arrives. Data does not capture the weight of a household where money is never discussed, except in moments of crisis, where the future is never planned for because planning feels like a luxury that belongs to other kinds of people. What the data measures are the outcomes. What it cannot measure is the mechanism, the invisible transmission of fear from one generation to the next, the way that fear takes root in the mind of a child and grows into a set of beliefs so deeply embedded that by adulthood they no longer feel like beliefs at all. They feel like facts. Psychologists and neurobiologists have spent decades studying what is now called intergenerational trauma, the way that severe stress, chronic scarcity, and repeated experiences of helplessness can alter not just a person's psychology, but the actual biology. There is research suggesting that the stress of living under conditions of persistent financial insecurity affects the brain's stress response systems in ways that can influence behavior long after the original circumstances have changed. Children who grow up in economically unstable households often develop a heightened sensitivity to threat, a shorter time horizon when it comes to planning and decision-making, and a more reactive relationship with uncertainty. These are not character flaws. They are adaptations. The brain of a child is extraordinarily plastic, and it is designed to learn from its environment, to absorb the rules of the world it is born into, and shape itself accordingly. If the world it is born into communicates that resources are unreliable, that tomorrow cannot be planned for, that safety is always one bad month away from disappearing, then the brain learns those lessons, and it learns them well, deeply, in ways that casual motivation and positive thinking will not touch. This is the part of the conversation that most self-help content skips, because it is uncomfortable. It is easier to talk about mindset as though it were a light switch, as though the right book or the right sermon or the right morning routine could simply override decades of neural conditioning in a weekend. It cannot. What it can do is begin a process. A long, non-linear, often frustrating process of becoming aware of inherited patterns, examining them with honesty, and making deliberate choices about which ones you will carry forward and which ones you will refuse to pass on to the next generation. That process is not easy, but it is possible. And faith, real faith, not the decorative kind that lives on bumper stickers and coffee mugs, but the kind that has survived loss and confusion and the silence of unanswered prayers, has always been one of the most powerful tools human beings have ever had for doing exactly that kind of deep structural change. The biblical concept of generational patterns is older than modern psychology by several thousand years. The Old Testament is full of family cycles, patterns of behavior and belief that repeat across generations with remarkable consistency. Fear showing up in fathers and sons, deception running through bloodlines, scarcity thinking passed from parent to child like an unspoken inheritance. But what makes the biblical tradition radical is not that it acknowledges these cycles, it is that it insists with complete seriousness that they can be broken, that the chain does not have to continue, that a person, one person, with enough conviction and enough willingness to do the hard interior work can become what theologians have sometimes called a cycle breaker. The one in the family line who decided that what was handed down would not be handed forward. If you have found this kind of content useful, consider subscribing. There is more like this coming, and it tends to go places the algorithm does not usually recommend. Ruth is one of the more striking examples of this in the ancient literature. She was a Moabite woman, a foreigner, with no inheritance rights, no land, no husband, no social safety net of any kind. By every structural measure available to her world, she was destined to remain exactly where circumstance had placed her. But she made a decision that had nothing to do with her circumstances and everything to do with her commitment. She attached herself to something larger than her immediate situation. She worked without complaint in the fields during harvest, gleaning what was left after the reapers passed. She was strategic without being manipulative. She was loyal without being passive. And she ended up not merely surviving, but becoming part of a lineage that changed the course of recorded history. The story is not presented as a fairy tale. It is presented as the consequence of choices. Specific, deliberate, costly choices made by a person who had every reason to stay small and chose not to. Joseph's story follows a similar structure, though more dramatically. A young man sold into slavery by his own brothers, imprisoned on false charges, forgotten by people who promised to remember him. If generational trauma has a face, Joseph knows it. Rejection, betrayal, abandonment, powerlessness, all stacked on top of each other in the early chapters of his life. And yet the thread that runs through his story is not bitterness. It is not the slow calcification of someone who has decided that the world is fundamentally unsafe and that the only rational response is to protect what little you have and trust nobody. It is something more difficult. It is the sustained, almost unreasonable decision to keep developing, to keep serving, to keep building competence and character, even in conditions that offered him no visible reason for optimism. By the time he stood before Pharaoh, he had been in Egypt for 13 years, most of them as a slave or a prisoner. But he had not stopped growing. He had not buried his capacity. And when the moment arrived, when the dream needed interpreting and the crisis needed managing, he was ready in ways that nobody around him was. There is a particular kind of poverty that has nothing to do with money. It is the poverty of imagination, the inability to picture a future different from the past, to see yourself in circumstances that your family has never occupied, to believe that the life you have witnessed is not the only life available to you. This kind is in many ways more devastating than the financial kind, because you can change your income without ever changing this. You can get a better job, move to a better neighborhood, clear your debt, and still carry inside you the unexamined conviction that abundance is not really meant for you, that it will not last, that something will take it away, that you do not quite deserve to be in the room. Therapists sometimes call this imposter syndrome, but for people whose families have lived in scarcity across multiple generations, it goes deeper than that. It is an identity question. It is the subterranean belief that wealth and people like you exist in separate categories, and that crossing the line between them is either impossible or somehow dishonest, as though prosperity would require you to betray where you came from. Breaking this requires something that goes beyond strategy. Strategy matters. Learning about money, understanding how it works, developing financial literacy, building income streams, saving consistently, investing patiently, all of that is necessary. But beneath it, holding it up, making it sustainable across the years when nothing seems to be working, beneath all of that, there has to be a shift in what you believe is true about yourself at the deepest level. There has to be a renegotiation of your identity, and this is where faith enters not as comfort, but as challenge, because the theological claim is not merely that God can bless you financially. The deeper claim is that you were made for more than you have been living. That the smallness you have accepted as normal was never the design. That you are not a footnote in someone else's story, but the protagonist of your own, with the full weight of divine intention behind the life you are trying to build. This does not make the work easier. It does not make the fear go away. Fear is one of the most ancient and sophisticated systems in the human brain, and it does not stand aside simply because you have decided to do something brave. What faith does, what it has always done for the people who take it seriously rather than wearing it as a cultural costume, is give you a reason to act in spite of the fear, to move forward before you feel ready, to plant before the rain has come, to step into the river before it has parted. Every major act of transformation in the biblical narrative happens in that sequence. The courage first, the confirmation second, not the other way around. Your grandmother washed those plastic bags because somewhere in her history, a lesson was learned that scarcity was the permanent condition. And that lesson was passed forward with love, because that is how generational patterns work. They are not transmitted maliciously, they are transmitted as protection, as the accumulated wisdom of people who survived hard things and wanted to make sure you would too. But protection designed for one set of circumstances can become a prison in another. And part of what it means to honor the people who came before you is not to simply repeat what they did, but to take what was useful and have the courage to leave behind what is no longer serving you, or, more precisely, what is no longer serving the generation that comes after you, because this is ultimately not about you alone. The person reading this is a link in a chain. Behind you are people who carry things they were never able to put down. Ahead of you are people who will inherit whatever you choose to pass on. The question of whether you decide to examine your relationship with money and scarcity and possibility is not merely a personal finance question, it is a legacy question. It is about what the children or grandchildren or students or people you influence will absorb from watching you move through the world. Whether they will learn that fear is the appropriate response to financial uncertainty, or whether they will learn something different, whether the cycle continues, or whether it stops with you. That is the weight of it. That is also the gift of it. Most of us do not get to choose the circumstances we are born into, but we get to choose every single day, in small decisions and large ones, what we do with what we were given, whether we bury it or build with it, whether we let the inherited fear write our story, or whether we decide, with whatever combination of faith and courage and stubbornness we can gather, to write something new. The chain can stop here. It has stopped before. It can stop again. And when it does, it stops not just for you. It stops for everyone who comes after.